Well, good morning. It is wonderful to be with you this morning. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We're going to be looking at the last portion of the chapter. We began it last week. We're going to continue on this morning. But as we jump into this, our homework. How many of you read Ecclesiastes chapter 3? Oh, wonderful. We're getting even more and more people each week getting on board with that. That's good. And the question that I left you with as we finished up last week, in light of the study, in light of verses especially 1 through 10, that there is a time for everything and that God has made it beautiful in His time. What is something that God has made that you enjoy? What is something that God has made that you enjoy, or that you find beautiful, or that you just like to see?
My family.
Your family. That's a great one. Another. Marriage. Another.
Just breaking the day. I love to be up in the morning, driving to work with the sun.
The sunrise. Another. The rivers and the lakes. And then one more. Something that God has made that you enjoy. The birds coming back. And the seasons. There is so much that God has made that is beautiful in its time. Even though we live in a sinful, fallen world, because of God, there is still, even in a sinful world, even in a fallen world, there is still so many gifts that He has given to us that we can see and enjoy. And that's what Ecclesiastes, the first portion of chapter 3 there, talks about. Even though we are mortal, even though there is a circle to life, God has still made these things and still given to us beauty and enjoyment in the things that are around us. This week we continue on with that. It's just a little bit different, a different experiment that Solomon is doing. And the main question of the book, we always start out with this: is life worth living, or what is the purpose of life? This is the main question that Solomon is asking in the book of Ecclesiastes. He wants to figure out what are the things in our lives that bring fulfillment, that bring satisfaction, that bring joy. So he is going to conduct a host of different experiments to figure out what are the things under the sun, if you separate God from all of these things, what are the things in this world that can possibly bring us joy and satisfaction? This week we're going to look at verses 16 down through verse 22. It's a shorter section. He starts off and he says, "And moreover I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. And I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and for every work. I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, that they might see that they themselves are beasts. For that which befalleth the sons of man befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them, as the one dies, so that dieth the other. They have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. All go unto one place, all are of the dust, and all return to dust again. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth? Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him?" I'm going to divide this section into three parts. The first two verses there are the fact that God will judge. The next four verses, 18 through 21, remind us of the fact that all men are mortal. And then in verse 22, he gives us his conclusion of this particular experiment. And this is an experiment that he necessarily didn't go out to do, but it's an observation that he made as he was looking out. So the first two things he says, God will judge. He says, moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there. The place of righteousness, that iniquity is there. And I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and for every work. I want to share with you a quote, and we're going to stop and make some comments as we go through this, but it just so wonderfully illustrates and explains what's going on here. So I put the verses up there so that you can read through and you can see those, but the first thing that we're going to look at is Solomon's viewpoint. As I said, this wasn't necessarily an experiment that he went out to do, but it was something that as he was living his life, he observed. And it was something that surprised him, and it frustrated him. He said, I saw under the sun that at the place of judgment, that wickedness was there, and at the place where things should be righteous, there was sin there. Solomon was surprised, and he was frustrated that wickedness was in places that it shouldn't be. So he looked at the world around him, and he saw the places of judgment, of justice. And he looked at those places and he said, wait a second. A place that should stand for justice and judgment, it's full of wickedness. And he got frustrated because he looked at those things. He said, it doesn't match. It should be good. It should stand up for what is right. It should stand up for justice. But when I see it's full of wickedness. Then he got frustrated. And then he looked at the place of righteousness and the things that should have been good. He said, well, I found sin there as well. So he made an observation and he was frustrated that things were in places that they didn't belong. You couldn't rely on justice because there was wickedness there. You couldn't rely on things that were supposed to be good because sin was there as well. The quote, it says, how can God be in control when there is so much evil in the world? Wicked people prosper in sin and good people suffer in obedience. He was frustrated. Solomon was not the first to ask that question. And he's not going to be the last. This kind of question has been asked again and again and again. But Solomon's conclusion, as he looked at the injustice that was around him, as he looked at the world, and he says, how is it possible that something that should stand for justice is just twisted, and something that should be good, well, that's messed up by sin? How is it possible? His conclusion, what comforted him, is in verse 17. He said, I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. He comforted himself with two things. First of all, that God has a time for everything, including judgment. And second of all, that God is working out his eternal purpose in and through the deeds of men, even the deeds of the wicked. So without God, separate from God, when we look around us at the things in this world, it can be incredibly frustrating. Things that should be good are twisted. Things that should stand for justice do not. And when you separate God from the picture, what you're left with is frustration. Because things aren't the way that they should. So without God, it's But his conclusion in verse 17 and what goes on from that is that he had to remind himself, okay, even though things aren't working right now, even though the wicked aren't being judged every time now, God has a purpose. There is a time for all of these different things. So even if right now it looks like there's injustice, there's going to be a time when God is going to bring those things in line with what they should be. He's going to bring justice. God has a time for all of those different things. So even though at times wicked people prosper when living in their sin, that's only a temporary thing. And even though there are times when good people suffer, that's also temporary. Because God has a time for everything. God is in control. Solomon was frustrated by injustice, but he was encouraged because he knew that there was a time when God would judge. Sometimes we look out at the world and we think, and it feels sometimes like God is ignoring the bad things that happen. But that's not the case. Just because God is not immediately judging evil doesn't mean that he is not active in bringing that judgment about. This is where it ties in with the next section that we're going to go on to as well. And it ties in with last week. So this is kind of a bridge. A time to cast, a time to kill, a time to heal. There's a time to born, a time to die. That, with the frustration that Solomon was seeing around him, he was able to comfort himself with the knowledge that God is going to judge. And then it ties in with what's to come, because even though it doesn't appear as though there is immediate judgment coming, God is still doing things to deal with those actions and that attitude. Even though he is not bringing final justice, God is still working in their lives. And that's what the next few verses say. So Solomon looked out and he was frustrated because things weren't where they were supposed to be. Things weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. There was injustice. But he reminded himself, God has a time for everything and he will judge. And also, he continues on in verse 18, he says, I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, that they might see that they themselves are beasts. Now that's an odd thing to say, that Solomon looked at things and he said, I know and I wish that God would remind us that we're very similar to animals. The idea that he's trying to get across is not we're basically just animals, so everybody's going to die because we're just animals. But, well, let's start from the beginning. I'm jumping ahead in my notes. Injustice, it's not fair. But it is not because of God that things are not fair. Injustice that we see around us shows us that we are the problem. People who take advantage of others like to think that they're better than other people. But the fact that we share our mortality with animals should put us in a better perspective to curb that pride and that attitude. Injustice shows us that there is a problem with us. People look out at the world and they see injustice and they think, that's God's problem. He has done this. But Solomon says, this isn't a God problem. Injustice is not a God-caused problem. We are the ones that caused it. So he said it is good for us, and one of the things that God has done is to remind us that we're going to end up just like animals end up. Death, that similarity to animals, is meant to curtail our sin, make us take life seriously, make us make decisions properly. People don't want to face death. They don't want to think about it at all. But when we do, when we are reminded, it helps us, and God has made it to help us act properly. For that, in verse 19, for that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them, as the one dieth, so dieth the others. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. Even if you think that there is no God out there, death reminds you that there is a reckoning at the end of your life, that things will come to an end. And the fear of that, the understanding of that mortality, is one of the ways that God is actively judging those who live in sin. If you live in sin, you are terrified of the future. That is a method of God's judgment to help them understand, I have a problem. My sin is bearing me down. If I'm doing things I'm not supposed to, it weighs on me. So we sometimes look at injustice and we think, God's not doing anything. But the reason why we have sin and why we have death is because God needs us to understand that our choices have consequences. So sometimes when, well, for instance, a leader of a country goes about to murder and destroy its people, sometimes they are not immediately judged. And we think it's not fair. Why isn't God intervening? But the fact is, God is constantly active. There is not a single person who lives in sin that is not miserable in their sin. And that is part of God's active judgment. And also His patience and love. The threat of death is necessary for us to understand we have a problem, God needs to fix it. So when you see injustice out there, be encouraged by the fact that everyone faces death. Because that often does more to curb people's attitudes and make them deal with their lives than anything else. So even though death is caused by sin, God is using it to draw people to Him. Only a gracious and loving God could take something that sin has destroyed and make it a tool to draw people to Him, for them to understand life. Because it can be very, very, very frustrating when you see an animal and you realize, I'm going to have to die just the same as they do. The same thing waits at the end of my life as that animal does. And if you're full of yourself, if you think you are a very self-important person, like you don't need God, the reminder of an animal's death brings you down a peg. And that's what Solomon said here. That which befalleth a man befalleth beasts. We're not the same as animals. But without God, when you view things without God, we share some frustrating similarities. If you subtract God, then in death we are no different than animals. This is not a positive pep talk. This is a smack you upside the head. Hey, you're going to die. Don't get proud. Deal with your sin. And that's what Solomon looked at the world, and he saw the frustration and injustice and all of these different things. And instead of pointing at God and saying, this is all your fault, he looked around and he said, wait a second. Without God, we're just like the animals. So why do we pretend to be so important? Why do I make a decision? Why does a nation, why do countries, why do people think that they're any better than anyone else? When at the point of death, they die just the same as animals do. Doesn't matter what color of skin you have, what nationality you are. It does not matter. You are no better without God than an animal, because all of us die in the same way. So if you have a problem with another race, that's a you problem. Because you haven't faced the reality. You are trying to make yourself feel better than someone else. But it doesn't work. Racist people are miserable because it doesn't match with reality. You're no better. Because every single one of us, without God, we die just the same as animals. Now again, I'm not saying humans are just animals. But the similarities between us are very frustrating if God is not involved. So Solomon says, I looked at the world, I saw injustice, and it didn't work, and I was frustrated. But then I looked at what God was doing, and I saw that He has made us so very similar to animals that just the understanding of that should help change how we view things, how we view other people, and how much I value myself. I should not value myself above others because we share the same kind of things even as the animals do. All go unto one place, verse 20 says, all are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth? No living person has been able to see what happens to humans and animals after we die. No living person. So the fact is, if you subtract God from life, you are left with the frustrating similarity to the fact that you can work your whole life, put all of your effort into gaining everything that this world has to offer, and then in the final moment of your life, you're going to die, just like the animal. And that will drive you mad without God. That is why there is a desperate search for immortality, for the fountain of youth, and all of these different things, because people don't want to die, because facing death makes them realize the frustrating similarity that they have and the lack of control that they have over life. God is using what sin destroyed to help us understand how much we need Him. Only God can do that. Death is a horrendous reality that we all face. But only when God is involved in our lives can even that have some benefit in our lives and in our society. So he comes down to the conclusion. First of all, God will judge. Second of all, we are mortal. We have to remember those two things. In light of that, and if we just left it there, we would once again be in a very disappointed and discouraged state. We would basically be left with, if we stopped there, we would be left with the knowledge that God's going to judge what I do, and at the end of my life, I'm going to die just like the animals do. That's a discouraging and frustrating place to be. But his conclusion, verse 22, he says, "Wherefore, I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him?" In light of the fact that we are mortal, what's the best thing for us to do? Enjoy your work and take life one day at a time. God will take care of injustice. There will be a day for that. Remember the book of Revelation. There is a time when God will judge injustice. So when you look and you see things that don't match, when you see injustice out there, remind yourself God is at work and God will take care of that. Second of all, don't be overwhelmed by the uncertainty. God has a perfect plan. Without God, at the end of our lives is death, just like an animal. We have no idea what's to come. Solomon says, don't worry about that. God is in control. Today, enjoy what God has given to you. Enjoy your work. Take life one day at a time. God has given to you. It is your lot in life. It is what God intends for you, that you enjoy the things that you're able to do. Don't let the fear of the future rob the present of its joy. Without God, you face the future with frustration and discouragement because you don't know what's coming and you're frustrated because you know that you're going to die. With God, we understand that there is so much more to come for us than death. As a result, I can enjoy today without living in fear of tomorrow. Because God takes care of that. That's why Ecclesiastes is so hard-hitting. Because we need to understand, if we take on the world's problems onto our own shoulders, you will be discouraged, frustrated, and unhappy. If you trust in God, God has given to you, when you trust in Him, everything in your life so that you can enjoy it. That's His lot for you. That's what He wants for you. Is in the midst of all of everything that's going on, in the middle of the fact that I know I am going to face death at some point, in the midst of all of that, I can still enjoy life because I know that God is in control of my future. That is our portion. God has given to you, your lot in life is to enjoy the things that you're able to do. So don't be overwhelmed by the uncertainty. God has a perfect plan. Enjoy the things that He brings into your life. So again, I'll finish the same way that we have before. Free your job, your projects, your hobbies, your things from the responsibility of making you happy. Rely on God to make you happy. Rely on God for your future, because only then will you be able to enjoy the things that God has made for you to enjoy. I know that the sunset is coming, but I can still enjoy the sunrise. I know that my life will come to an end at some point. But I also know that God is going to raise me after that. So I can enjoy my birthday as well as even finding joy in everything that God has in store for me. No matter how dark. Because I know He's in control. Only when you are trusting in God can you have the ability to enjoy the blessings that He has given to you today. Because if you rely on even life to give you what you need, It's not going to be enough. Your things aren't going to be enough. Your job, your projects, all of these things are not going to be enough to keep you happy. But if you rely on God, life, your jobs and projects and all of these other different things, they can bring you joy. Enjoy them. When you go to work, enjoy it. When you're not working, enjoy that. Whatever it is that you do, you can find joy in that when you're trusting in God. Doesn't mean that everything's always going to be cheerful and wonderful and great. But it means that you can properly rely on God. He's not going to let you down. He will always be enough to get you through. Now, I know that there might be a lot of questions, so we're going to finish off right here. Just going to remind you, read Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Actually, that's our homework, is chapter 4. I forgot to change that from the 3 to the 4. And then what is something about your work that you enjoy? Try to think of something about the labor that you put in that you really enjoy. Something in there that God has given to you that you find fulfilling and joy in. So let's close in a word of prayer, and then we'll open it up for questions or comments. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to look through the book of Ecclesiastes and help us, Lord, to understand, to not be discouraged, but to be encouraged when we trust in you. It can be discouraging to look around us and see injustice, but you are in control. You do have a plan. And while you're being very patient, you have even built into this sinful world something that will draw us, that is meant to help us understand that we need you. So help us, Lord, to see that. Help the world to understand how short our life is, that we shouldn't take advantage of others, but that we should trust in you. In your name we pray. Amen.